The restaurant was Italian. Red and white checkered tablecloths. The kind of place that looks romantic in movies but feels a little tight when you are actually sitting there. My engagement dinner. 14 years ago. Richard was across from me. My father-in-law, his son, my fiancé then, was next to me, turned toward his mother, laughing at something she said. Richard leaned across the table. He thought his voice was low enough. It was not. He said, "You seem nice." But he could have done better. I did not drop my fork. I did not excuse myself. I did not cry. I took a sip of wine. I looked at him. I smiled. And I decided, in that exact second, that I would spend the rest of my life making sure his son never wondered if he could have. Not for Richard. Not to prove him wrong. For my husband. For the man I loved, who deserved a wife who never let him doubt. That was 14 years ago. Richard died last week. My husband is grieving. I am grieving with him. For him, not for Richard. Because Richard never knew what I did. He never knew that every day for 14 years I woke up and asked myself, is he wondering today? And every day the answer was no. Because I made sure of it. That is not revenge. That is love. And love, I have learned, is the only answer to a sentence spoken in a restaurant on a night that should have been perfect. My name is Claire. I am 42 now, but I was 28 when I sat across from Richard at my engagement dinner. 28 years old, in love with his son, and already being measured like a piece of property he was considering whether to accept. The restaurant was my mother-in-law's choice. Too expensive for my parents, who smiled and nodded and tried too hard to impress Richard. I watched them. I watched him. Richard spent most of the dinner asking about my job, my education, my family's background. He was not making conversation. He was auditing. Checking my credentials against whatever invisible checklist he kept in his head. My parents answered politely. My father mentioned his small business. My mother mentioned her teaching degree. Richard nodded. He did not seem impressed. He did not seem unimpressed. He just seemed like a man who had already made up his mind and was waiting for the evidence to catch up. David was next to me. He did not notice. He was talking to his mother about something I do not remember. He was happy. That was the part that hurt later. He was so happy. He had no idea his father was across the table, leaning in, about to say something that would sit in my chest for 14 years. The sentence came after dessert. Richard leaned toward me. His voice was low enough that he thought no one else could hear. He said, "You seem nice." But he could have done better. I did not react. I took a sip of wine. I smiled. Then I excused myself to the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror. The restaurant was loud enough that no one could hear me talking to myself. I looked at my reflection. I said out loud, "He said his son could have done better. He is wrong. And I am going to spend the rest of my life proving it. Not to him, to David. Every day, quietly, without ever saying a word about this night. I did not tell David. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell anyone. I carried the sentence like a stone in my chest. Not a burden. A promise. I would make sure David never wondered if he could have done better. That was the promise. And I kept it for 14 years. I washed my hands. I fixed my lipstick. I walked back to the table. David smiled at me. Richard looked at me. I smiled back at both of them. David never knew what happened in that bathroom. He never knew what his father said. He never knew that his wife made a vow that night that had nothing to do with the wedding and everything to do with a sentence she would never repeat. That was 14 years ago. I have never told anyone. Until now. The first year I started small. I paid attention to the things David did not say. The way he rubbed his neck when he was tired. The way he got quiet when work was hard. The way he looked at the coffee maker every morning like he was hoping it would read his mind. So, I became the one who read his mind. Coffee ready before he walked into the kitchen. His favorite meal on the table after a bad day. A quiet hour after work where I did not ask questions. I did not make a performance of any of it. I just did it.
Consistently.
Reliably. Like breathing. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to notice the man you married. David started saying things. Little things at first. You're good to me. Then bigger. I'm so lucky. I heard those words, and I thought about Richard. About the restaurant. About the sentence that started all of this. David said he was lucky. I said, you're not lucky. You're loved. I meant it. I also meant you could not have done better. Because this is what better looks like. Not flashy. Not performative. Just present. Every day. One night, about a year in, we were lying in bed. David turned to me. He said, I don't know how you always know what I need. I said I pay attention. He said, no one has ever paid attention to me like this. I was quiet for a minute. Then I said, then no one was paying attention correctly. I did not tell him that I was paying attention because of a sentence his father said at a restaurant. I did not tell him that every act of attention was a quiet rebuttal. I kept that knowledge to myself. It was not a secret. It was a fuel. And it burned cleanly. David fell asleep. I stayed awake. I thought about Richard. About whether he noticed. Whether he saw his son happy and wondered if maybe he had been wrong. Probably not. Richard did not seem like the kind of man who wondered if he was wrong. But that did not matter. I was not doing this for Richard. I was doing it for David. And for myself. Because I needed to prove that the sentence was false. Not to Richard. To the girl in the bathroom mirror who made a promise she intended to keep. I kept it. That first year. And the next. And the next. I never stopped paying attention. Not because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. Because paying attention had become who I was. The insult was the spark. But the fire was mine. And I was going to keep it burning. Jenna and I met for lunch about 3 years into my marriage. We had been friends since college. She knew something happened at the engagement dinner. She saw my face when I came back from the bathroom. She never asked. Until that day. She put her fork down. She said, what did Richard say to you? At the dinner. I saw your face afterward. I said nothing important. She said your face said something important. I was quiet for a minute. Then I told her. The restaurant. The tablecloth. Richard leaning in. The sentence. His son could have done better. I told her about the bathroom mirror. The promise. The 14 years I had been keeping it. Jenna was quiet. Then she said, you've been carrying that for how long? I said I am not carrying it. I am using it. She asked using it how? I said every time I make him coffee. Every time I listen to his day. Every time I choose him over something else. That is me using it. That is me making sure he never wonders. She said that sounds exhausting. I said it is not. It is just love. With a little extra fuel. Jenna did not tell me to stop. She did not tell me to tell David. She did not tell me to confront Richard.
She just looked at me. She saw me.
That was enough. She picked up her fork and started eating again. We talked about something else. But I could tell she was thinking about it. About the weight of a sentence spoken in a restaurant that should have been perfect. About whether motivation matters if the outcome is love. I did not have an answer. I still do not. But I know David has never wondered if he could have done better. That is not nothing. That is everything. And if the origin of that everything was an insult from a man who is now dead, I can live with that. The fuel does not care where it came from. It only cares that it burns. Richard never stopped. That was the thing I did not expect. I thought the engagement dinner would be the end of it. One sentence. One moment of cruelty that I could absorb and transform. But Richard was not a one-sentence man. He was a drip. A slow, steady drip of small comments that could have been compliments if you did not know how to listen. She's done well for herself. Said at a birthday dinner, like he was surprised. You two seem happy. Said at a Christmas gathering, like he was checking a box. Backhanded. Always deniable. If David ever asked, Richard could say he was just being nice. But I knew. I knew because I had heard the real thing at the engagement dinner. The rest was just echoes. I never reacted. I smiled. I changed the subject. I protected David from the knowledge that his father measured our marriage. Measured me. Found me wanting. Every time Richard opened his mouth, I built another brick in the wall. David did not need to know.
He was happy.
That was the point. One night, David said to me, "My dad really likes you." I said, "I am glad." I did not say, "Your father thinks you settled." I never will. Then came the comment that almost broke me. David mentioned it casually. We were making dinner. He said, "My dad said something weird today." He asked if I ever wonder what my life would have been like if I had married someone else. My heart stopped. I kept chopping vegetables. I asked, "What did you say?" David shrugged. I said, "I don't wonder. I got it right the first time." I smiled. I said, "Good answer." I did not say, "Your father is still trying. He has been trying for years. And you have never once wondered." That is the only victory that matters. I did not tell David that his father had been undermining our marriage since the engagement dinner. I did not tell him that I had been running interference for 14 years. I kept that knowledge. It was not a burden. It was the wall between my husband and his father's doubt. And I would keep building it for as long as I needed to. But that night, after David fell asleep, I lay awake. I thought about the question Richard asked. What if David had married someone else? Someone his father approved of. Someone with better credentials. Someone who did not have to try so hard. I did not know if David would have been happier. I knew he would not have been loved the same way. Because the way I loved him was forged in that restaurant. Every act of attention. Every cup of coffee. Every quiet hour after work. All of it came from a sentence I never repeated. That did not make it less real. It made it more deliberate. I was not protecting David from a truth. I was protecting him from a man who confused measuring with caring. And if that protection was a lie, it was a lie I would tell every day for the rest of my life. Because David never wondered. And that was not nothing. That was everything. Richard got sick in year 13. Cancer. 6 months, the doctors said. Maybe less. David came home from the appointment and sat on the edge of the bed. He did not cry. He just stared at the wall. I sat next to him. I did not say I'm sorry because that felt like a performance. I just sat. The weeks that followed were hard. David spent weekends at his parents' house. He came home exhausted. He said, "I wish he had more time." I said, "Then give him all the time you have." I meant it. I also meant, I will not poison this. I will not tell you what he said. You will grieve your father without knowing the man I heard at the engagement dinner. One night David cried. In bed. He said, he wasn't always easy.
But he loved me.
I said, I know. He asked, do you think he was proud of me? I paused. Then I said, yes. I think he was proud of you. I think he just didn't know how to say it. I was not lying. Richard was proud. Richard just also believed his son could have done better. Both things are true. And I will carry the second one to my grave. Jenna called. She asked, are you going to tell him? Before Richard dies. I said no. She asked why not. I said because telling him would be for me, not for him. And I have spent 14 years making decisions for him. I am not going to stop now. I visited Richard in the hospital once. David was getting coffee. Richard looked at me from the bed. He was thinner, smaller. The man who had leaned across a restaurant table and measured me was now a collection of tubes and pale skin. He said, you've been good to him. I said, I've been good to us. He nodded. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. I was not there for an apology. I was there because my husband needed me to be, and I have always shown up for my husband. That is the promise I made. That is the promise I kept. I stayed for 10 minutes.
We talked about nothing.
The weather. The nurses. David came back with coffee. He sat next to his father. I stood by the window. I watched them. I thought about the sentence. The restaurant. The girl in the bathroom mirror who made a promise. She had kept it. She was still keeping it. And she would keep it until Richard was in the ground and beyond. Because that was not about Richard anymore. It was about David. It had always been about David. Richard died on a Tuesday. David was holding his hand. I was holding David's other hand. The room was quiet. Then it was quieter. David cried. I did not. Not because I was cold. Because I had already done my crying 14 years ago in a bathroom at an Italian restaurant when I decided that I would spend my life proving a dead man wrong. The funeral was 3 days later. David stood at the casket. I stood next to him. He cried again. I held his hand. A relative I did not know approached. She said, "You must be relieved." He was difficult. I looked at her. I said, "He was my husband's father. That's all I need to remember." She walked away. I looked at the casket. The red and white tablecloth flashed in my mind. The restaurant. The wine. The sentence. Richard leaning in. You could have done better. I felt nothing. Not forgiveness. Not revenge. Not relief. Just the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. David had never wondered. Not once. And I was the reason why. At the reception, David pulled me aside. He said, "You were so good to him, even when he was hard." I said, "I was good to you. That's different." He said, "Same thing." I said, "No, it's not. But you don't need to know the difference." He looked at me. He did not ask what I meant. He just nodded. He was tired. Grief does that. It smooths over the questions you might otherwise ask. I let him nod. I let him believe what he needed to believe. I did not tell David about the hospital visit. I did not tell him about the sentence. I never will. Some things are not for sharing. They are for carrying. And I have been carrying this for 14 years. I can carry it a little longer. Forever if I have to. The reception ended. We drove home. David fell asleep in the car. I drove. I thought about the weight of a secret kept for love. Was it lighter or heavier than the weight of the truth? I did not know. I knew that telling David would lift the secret from my chest and place it in his. He would have to carry the knowledge that his father thought he settled. That his father measured his marriage and found it wanting. That his wife had been running interference for 14 years without ever saying a word. That knowledge would not help David grieve. It would only add another layer of pain to an already heavy loss. So I kept the secret. Not because I was afraid. Because I was protective. And protection, when it is done right, looks exactly like love. David never wondered. That was the promise. I kept it. Richard was in the ground. The promise was still standing. That was not victory. That was just the difference between a sentence spoken in a restaurant and a marriage built in silence. I chose the marriage. Every day. For 14 years. And I would choose it again. I'm over at where silence ends. Subscribe if any of this sounds familiar. Months after the funeral, David found a letter. It was in a box of Richard's things his mother gave him. The envelope said, "For David," in Richard's handwriting. Not my name. Not our names. Just his son. David opened it while I was making dinner. He started reading aloud. Richard said he was proud. He said he loved his son. He said he hoped David was happy. That was it. No mention of me. No mention of the marriage. Just a father telling his son that he mattered. David folded the letter. He said, "He never really knew how to talk about you." I said, "I know." David was quiet for a minute. Then he asked, "Did he ever say something to you? Something I should know about?" I stopped chopping vegetables. I put the knife down. I turned around. I had carried this for 14 years. I had promised myself I would never tell him. But he asked, and I was tired of carrying it alone. I said, "He said you could have done better." At the engagement dinner, I heard him. David's face went blank.
What?
I said, I have never told anyone. I have spent 14 years making sure you never wondered if he was right. You have not wondered. That is the only thing that matters. He asked why I did not tell him. I said because telling you would have made you choose. And I did not want you to have to choose. I wanted you to just love me, without the weight of his opinion. David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he was wrong. I said, I know. He said, you should have told me. I said, maybe. But I am telling you now. And nothing changes. Except you know. And that is okay. He took my hand.
He did not let go.
I had finally put the stone down. Not on the table. In my husband's hand. And he was holding it with me. That was the difference between carrying something alone and carrying it together. I did not know I was allowed to share it. I thought protection required silence. I was wrong. But I learned. 14 years later, I learned. I did not apologize for keeping the secret. I did not defend my choice. I just sat with my husband. We were quiet together. The kitchen was warm. The vegetables sat half-chopped on the cutting board. None of it mattered. What mattered was that he knew. And he had not let go of my hand. That was not forgiveness. That was just love. The same love I had been building for 14 years. It did not need his father's approval. It never had. David did not sleep well for a week after I told him.
He was not angry at me.
I watched him carefully. He was angry at his father. At himself for never noticing. He said things like, I should have known, and how did I miss it? And he sat across from us at every holiday. I said, you didn't notice because I didn't want you to notice. I was very good at hiding it.
He looked at me.
You shouldn't have had to hide. I thought about it. Then I said, maybe.
But I chose to.
And I would choose it again. He asked how I did it. 14 years of smiling at someone who said that about me. I said, I wasn't smiling at him. I was smiling at you. Every time I saw you happy, I won. He did not even know we were playing. David was quiet. He was trying to understand. I could see him turning it over in his mind. The weight of it. The years. The silence. I did not tell him that I thought about the sentence every day. That it was fuel. That it kept me warm on cold mornings when I made his coffee. That it was not a burden, it was a fire. I did not say this because David was already grieving enough. He did not need to know that his wife's love was partly forged in the fire of his father's insult. He just needed to know that it was real. And it was. It always was. Jenna's question came back to me that week. Does motivation matter if the outcome is love? I had wondered for years. Now I knew the answer. The insult stopped mattering a long time ago. Somewhere around year 5. Or year 8. I could not remember. What mattered was the daily practice of love. The coffee. The listening. The quiet hour after work. The insult was just the spark. The fire was always mine. I built it. I tended it. I kept it burning. Richard did not get credit for that. He got a son who grieved him and a daughter-in-law who showed up at his hospital bed. That was more than he deserved. That was love. Not because of him. Despite him. David took my hand one night. He said, I'm sorry you carried that alone. I said, I am not alone anymore. He nodded. That was enough. The origin of love does not matter. Only the fact of it. Steady and warm. 14 years later. Still burning. We went back to the Italian restaurant on our anniversary. The same one. The same red and white tablecloths. I had not been there since the engagement dinner. David chose it. He did not know. He just remembered that we had talked about going back someday. Someday was 14 years later. We sat at a different table. Not the one near the window where Richard had leaned across and measured me. A table in the corner. Quieter. The wine list was different. The waitstaff was different. Everything was different except the tablecloths and the memory I had stopped carrying alone. David raised his glass. He said, to my wife, who I could not have done better than. I raised mine. I did not say, I know. I said, to us. We drank. The sentence was gone. Not forgotten, but no longer carried. It was sitting at the bottom of a wine glass in a restaurant that had once held the worst moment of my marriage. Now it held something else. A toast. A clink. A woman who had finally stopped pretending that love required silence. Later that night, I stood in the bathroom. The same kind of bathroom where I had made my promise 14 years ago. I looked at myself in the mirror. I thought about Richard. About the sentence. About the years of coffee and listening and quiet hours after work. I thought about David's hand in mine at the funeral. About the letter that did not mention me. About the moment in the kitchen when I finally told the truth. I said to myself, quietly, he said his son could have done better. He was wrong.
His son did exactly right.
And I spent 14 years making sure he knew it. Not because of Richard. Because of David. Because love is not a rebuttal. Love is a choice.
And I chose.
Every day. For 14 years. I would choose it again. I did not tell David that I still think about the engagement dinner sometimes. I do not need to. He knows I carry things. He carries some of them now too. The stone is in 2 hands. That is lighter. Not light, but lighter. The red and white tablecloths appear in my dreams sometimes. I used to wake up from those dreams with my heart pounding. Now I wake up and roll over and put my hand on David's chest. He is warm. He is here. He never wondered if he could have done better. That was the promise. I kept it. Love is sometimes quiet. Quiet love is still love. It is just love that has learned to wait. 14 years. For a sentence to die. For a husband to finally understand. For a stone to be placed in 2 hands instead of 1. Richard was wrong. His son could not have done better. Because better did not exist. There was just me. And I was enough. I always was.
I just needed 14 years to know it.
And now I do. That is where the silence ends. Not with a shout. With a quiet clink of glasses in a restaurant with red and white tablecloths. The same restaurant. The same tablecloths. A different marriage. A different woman. The same love. Finally spoken. Finally seen. Finally enough. I'm over at where silence ends. Have you ever carried a secret to protect someone you loved and wondered if the silence was worth it?